Slava Ukraine. Herodium Slava. So right now we are seeing another refugee crisis into Europe. This time it isn't refugees coming in from Syria or Iraq. This time it is refugees coming from Ukraine. And it's interesting to point out that in the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015, Europe absorbed around 1 million or so Syrian refugees. In a matter of weeks, Europe has absorbed almost 3 million Ukrainian refugees. And what I find amazing is how the right wing right now is not talking about a refugee crisis. They're not describing this as a refugee crisis. Generally speaking, people are just talking about Ukrainian refugees, how we have to help Ukrainian refugees. And when it was Syrian refugees, people mocked at the idea of helping those people. People mocked at the idea of helping refugees from Syria. People started talking about IQ differences, how Syrians have lower IQs, Middle Eastern people have lower IQs somehow, or they come from a third world culture, they come from a primitive society, they don't share our Western values, therefore we shouldn't help them. And there was a tremendous amount of animosity, enmity, vitriol, viciousness, and resistance towards the idea of helping Syrian refugees. I remember hearing people talking about how, there's refugees in hotels and, refugees are coming to America, they're going to cross the border and take over America and they're going to bring in Sharia law. I remember hearing some pastor talking about how, I had a dream from the Lord and ISIS was crossing the border from Mexico into Texas and they were taking over Texas. Oh yeah. Yeah, like a bunch of keffiyeh-wearing militants from the deserts of Iraq and Syria are going to cross the border into Texas and vanquish some good old Texas boys who were just holding up their shotguns and their rifles, just going out pig hunting. Just going out hunting wild boars, and they saw some ISIS fighters. Oh, I'd be damned. Who would have known? But there really is no resistance or vitriol or viciousness towards the idea of helping Ukrainian refugees. Nothing. I haven't seen any resistance in the Western media. I haven't seen right-wing pundits talking about Ukrainian refugees in the same manner as they were talking about Syrian refugees. I don't see the vicious rhetoric. And I don't think there should be vicious rhetoric against Ukrainian refugees. I don't think there should be vitriol against the idea of helping Ukrainian refugees. I don't think so. I think that we should help refugees. I think we should help Ukrainian mothers and their children, and Ukrainian mothers who are not with their husbands because their husbands are stuck in Ukraine and they're helpless. These women are helpless with their children. I have no issue with helping widows and their children because that would be the compassionate thing to do. That would be the human thing to do. Just as I am not against the idea of helping Syrian refugees. But no one gave a damn about Syrian refugees. Let's be honest here. I mean, there were NGOs and there were liberals and maybe, there were people in Antifa who were enthusiastic and passionate about the idea of helping Syrian refugees. But for the most part, there was tremendous resistance against such an idea, against such an action. To the point where literally every Nazi in Europe came out of the closet to speak out against helping refugees from the Middle East. Every Nazi, every European that was a Nazi or was some crazy ultranationalist and was kind of hiding their views, or maybe they were fringe, maybe they weren't so certain that they should be sharing and expressing their beliefs, they all came out of the woodwork. They all came out of the backwoods. And they became mainstream voices. That is how thick the resistance was in Europe towards helping Middle Eastern refugees. I'm not seeing that with Ukrainian refugees. I'm not. And if the Syrian refugees were European, Caucasian, because Syrians are Caucasian, and many Syrians actually look very similar to Europeans. But we don't see them as European because they're from the Middle East. We don't really take into account that they are Caucasian. We just think, oh, they're from the Middle East, therefore, they're cavemen. But if the Syrians were European Caucasian, there would be no resistance. I don't think you would see the same sort of animosity towards the action of helping them. Now, Poland has absorbed the great majority of these Ukrainian refugees, and Poland has a history of helping refugees. It does. It has a long history of helping migrants. You can go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, and you will see that Poland was a major center for Jewish migration. Jews who were escaping pogroms and they were escaping persecution, they would go to Poland. There was persecution against Jews in Russia, and many of those Jews fled into Poland. And during the Holocaust, when the Germans and their European acolytes were trying to exterminate the Jews within the continent of Europe, it was the Poles who rescued more Jews than anyone in Europe. Poland has a rich history of this, and I admire this about Poland. I really do. I really do. The thing is that the Poles were also amongst the most resistant towards the idea of helping Syrian refugees. But they had no issue with helping Ukrainian refugees. And again, I admire their compassion towards their Ukrainian neighbor. I don't think they shouldn't help Ukrainian refugees. What I'm saying is that while they have compassion, or they have their arms wide open for Ukrainian refugees, they had little to no interest or enthusiasm in helping their fellow Syrian man, their fellow Syrian human. And what I find interesting is that Polish people talk a lot about their past turmoils. They talk about how the Soviets butchered them, how the Soviets murdered around 1 million Polish people. They talk about the massacre of Katyn, when the Soviets were murdering Polish dissidents. And they will also talk about a little-known massacre called the Massacre of Volhynia. And the Massacre of Volhynia was not just one massacre. When the Polish people talk about Volhynia, they're really referring to a series of massacres that took place within certain parts of eastern Poland. So Volhynia, East Galicia, Chelm, Lvov, etc. And at that time, this was eastern Poland, the areas of Poland that bordered with Western Ukraine. And today, Western Ukraine is where most of the Ukrainian fascists thrive. The Poles love talking about how Ukrainian fascists in the early 1940s butchered around 100,000 Polish people because they hated Poles, because these Ukrainian nationalists saw the Poles as the thieves of their land and the reason for their lack of success in life. And so they decided to unleash a diabolical and satanic rage against their Polish neighbors. And regardless of this history, the Poles have accepted the Ukrainians with arms wide open. And I admire this. I'm not condemning this. It shows me that, and it shows really the world, that the Poles have a great grasp on the concept of forgiveness. But here's the reality, is that no Syrian ever tried to do that to the Polish people. There are no Syrians crying out, death to Poles. There are no Syrians who are admiring Stepan Bandera or Andrei Melnik, two of the masterminds behind the slaughter of the Poles in the early 1940s. But yet in Ukraine, you still have high concentrations of people who admire those who murdered the Poles. Now, there are a number of things that I want to point out to you guys, and I found this to be very interesting, because when I saw that Europe was absorbing all of these Ukrainian refugees, I was thinking, I wonder if there's eventually going to be some sort of anger towards these people. And I haven't really seen anything in Poland, but I don't think I have seen anything in Romania, although I haven't really checked, so maybe there is something there. But I did find something in the Moldovan media. And there was an article that was published recently by a Russian publication called Izvestia. And it talks about how Moldovans are upset, some Moldovans are upset at some of the Ukrainian refugees. Because Moldovans speak two languages. They speak Romanian and they speak Russian. And since Moldova has absorbed a significant amount of the Ukrainian refugees, the Moldovans have no other way to communicate with the Ukrainians other than with the Russian language. Because all Ukrainians speak Russian, right? All Ukrainians speak Ukrainian and they speak Russian. Moldovans speak Russian and Romanian. So it makes sense, it's inevitable that Moldovans are going to resort to speaking in Russian to communicate with these refugees. Well, a number of the Ukrainian refugees don't like that. They don't like it when Moldovans speak to them in Russian. They lash out at Moldovans who speak to them in Russian. And I want to read to you guys some excerpts from this article from Izvestia. It says, so one of the local residents said that some refugees placed in the hotel did not like that the pool was closed. She also spoke about an incident that occurred at a catering point. A Ukrainian, having ordered several hamburgers, and yes, they do eat burgers in Moldova, this is news to me, showed his passport instead of paying for the order. So the girl notes, the man hoped that because of the situation around Ukraine, he would be served for free. She also talked about the refusal of some Ukrainian refugees to speak Russian with Moldovans. So this Ukrainian guy walks in there, buys a bunch of hamburgers, and then the lady gives him the bill, and he just pulls out his passport and says, give me some free food. Well, it doesn't work that way. Here's another appeal of a local resident who also speaks of the bad manners of some refugees. He noted that out of 100% of those who arrived, only 30% were happy. Quote, the remaining 70% go around and fight with everyone in a row, shouting, glory to Ukraine, Slava Ukraine, and yelling that they are served in Russian. You must understand that they are trying to serve you in a language that you understand, the man said. And there was a girl, Moldovan girl, who said, a refugee from Ukraine arrived at a hotel and went into a restaurant. He attacked the waitress as she speaks Russian. She spoke in a way that both he and she could understand. No need to come to our country to teach us how to speak. I beg you to show respect for us. This is what she said. As we welcome everyone in our small country with open arms, with a very big heart. So there are obviously some problems that have been going on in Moldova. I'm not sure if a similar thing is happening in Poland. I'm not sure if a similar thing is happening in Romania, but we know this is happening in Moldova. And it's interesting that the complaints about self-entitlement, similar to the complaints that we heard in regards to the Syrian refugees. Oh, they come in here with the sense of entitlement. They come in here feeling entitled, that they're entitled because they're refugees. But we're seeing similar complaints in regards to the Ukrainian refugees. Isn't it interesting that a people who are Slavic can cause problems to other Slavs, even though they're of the same racial strata? They come from that Slavic group of people. They come from the Slavic world. They will still cause problems for each other. They may even try to orchestrate genocide against each other. In the case of the Ukrainians trying to exterminate the Polish people in eastern Poland in the early 1940s. Russians also butchered millions of Ukrainians in the Holodomor, which was orchestrated under the Stalin regime. Isn't it interesting that we sit here and talk about, refugees are bad because these refugees are bad because they're not of the same culture as we are. They don't look like us. We want people who look like us. And yet some of the most horrific atrocities have been committed by people slaughtering those who look like them and who speak either a similar language as they do or the same language that they have. We can even see this in the Middle East with the Palestinians versus the Lebanese. They're neighbors. They both speak Arabic. They're both Semitic. They both look similar, and they hate each other to this day. Syrians and Lebanese speak Arabic. They look alike. They're neighbors, and they hate each other to this day. Especially the Lebanese especially Maronites, they have tremendous hatred towards Syrians. I've seen it myself. It can be pretty atrocious at times. Africa. Africans have killed each other. The Rwandan genocide was between two tribes, both African, both look alike, and there was slaughter and bloodshed. Irish Civil War, Protestant Irish people versus Catholic Irish people, both speak the same language. They both look alike. You can't tell the difference between the two, but they killed each other. English people facilitating the slaughter of millions of Irish people through the Irish potato famine. English people and Irish people, both white, both look similar, both are neighbors, and they hate each other. And the British did the worst oppressions on the Irish people. No one has ever done to the Irish people what the British did to them in the past. So when we talk about refugees, people will say, well, the Poles accepted the Ukrainian refugees because they look alike. Well, the Ukrainians and the Poles looked alike when the Ukrainians were butchering them and flailing them alive, skinning them alive. Yeah. I want to read to you guys a list of methods of killing people. Here we go. Cutting the torso in half with a carpentry saw. Slicing open the front of the torso of a woman with a garden pocket knife from the vagina to the neck and leaving the insides outside. Put a glass bottle in the vagina and break it. Cutting and pulling narrow strips of flesh off a person's back. This wasn't done by Syrians. It wasn't done by Arabs. This was done by Ukrainian nationalists towards Polish people. And we will sit here and admire the slogans of the Ukrainian nationalists. Slava Ukraini. Heroyam Slava. Glory to the heroes. We'll sit here and talk as if it's cute, as if it's patriotic. But what they're never going to tell us is the other part of that Ukrainian slogan. Smert lachum. Death to Poles.
З вільною Україною. Ходу!
Yeah. Slava Ukraina.